The big thing at the end of the day is just research. You've got to get in your topic and bring it all together. So the challenge really is you've got to think about how you're going to convey that information. And do you go with the conventions of the genre? Do you break them and do something? These are all creative choices, but you can't do that until you're on a firm footing with your actual knowledge of the topic, because then you know what you can bend and what you can break, what you can ignore, what you can even subvert sometimes.
Good afternoon everyone, welcome to May Books and Beverages. May is actually Local History Month, so it's quite fitting that we have an author, Vincent Formosa, who's going to talk about historical fiction with us today. He has written 11, this is his 11th book, he has just published last month, I think, all World War II historical fiction, with the main focus on the RAF. Now, I've spoken to Vincent before today, and we are both passionate about World War II history, and I think it's such a huge genre. You could write about anything. You could write about Winston Churchill, about the battles, about Dunkirk, about D-Day. What I like about Vincent's books is they're all historical based, but from a different perspective, and I think that just brings something new to historical fiction. And his 12th book is actually on the way. So, without further ado, we're going to start with the questions, if that's okay, Vincent. Okay. And today's a little bit different because normally, those of you who normally come, there's a lot of questions. What today we're going to do, we're going to allow the author to actually talk more about it, because let's face it, you've come to hear Vincent talk and not me. So he will be talking for some substantial time about each question. So the first question is, how did you choose your subject and time period?
Right, okay, well, good afternoon everybody. It's a pleasure to be back again, to be asked again, so this is my third time. The thing with me is I always need to find something that I'm actually interested in. It has to grab my attention, because it would be very easy to do a story about, Spitfires or whatever, but I sort of aim for something different, because I try to pick a sort of slice of time and sort of shine a window on what it must have been like for a bunch of characters to go through a particular period of the war. So in writing, I think there's a big temptation with people sometimes to follow the trend of the market. Yeah, and if you look at what happened after the Da Vinci Code and when 50 Shades of Grey came out, the market was flooded by clones of those sorts of books, and some were okay, some were pretty dreadful. I know my mum came home with a few of them at the time, and I sort of read them, and they were a bit. But and this is in the days before AI as well, so somebody spent weeks writing this just to sort of chase the market. Not for me. So the base answer to the question is that there'll be an aircraft or a scenario that I see that stimulates some interest, and it might be a magazine article, it might be a photograph, or it might be just a particular personal account that I've come across in my research that it tickles my interest. So for example, Calico RNVR, which was my 5th novel, I'd always had this sort of passing interest in aircraft carriers. And then I came across this reference to the British Pacific Fleet, and I thought, that's a bit odd, because in World War II, we fought in Burma, and the Pacific was the Americans' playground. And then it turns out that in actual fact, we had a whole task force out there with a bunch of aircraft carriers fighting alongside the Americans all the way through to Japan, having to deal with the kamikazes off the island of Formosa and Sakishima Gunto. Never heard of this, and you think the soldiers in Burma refer to themselves as the Forgotten Army. I think the British Pacific Fleet is even rates even low, because I hadn't heard about it at all. So it just has to be something that really sort of grabs me. I'll start reading about the aircraft and the operations it was involved in, and if I can find a gap in history, and thinking about how I'll go for it. But it has to be something that's going to stimulate me, because I can't just write. I have to actually be bothered about it. Otherwise, it just isn't going to happen.
I think having an interest in what you're writing about is probably the first point for any author. If you try and write something, if you try and copy it, for instance, I mean, I tried once to write a Mills and Boon book. It was the worst mistake I ever made, because I don't read those books, I'm not interested in it, but I just thought I would just try, and anyway, it failed miserably, because I much prefer cozy crime and historical fiction. So I do agree, you have to, what gets your interest, what can you learn more about it, and how can you develop that into a story?
Very much so.
So this brings me, we've been discussing this, the challenges in writing historical fiction for anybody else who writes historical fiction. It is a massive challenge, because you are weighing up facts with the story, and you have to get it right. It's really, really important. So my question, Vincent, is what are the challenges in writing historical fiction? How do you ensure you get the fact right?
Well, we won't get through it in an afternoon. I'll get the sort of the overview. I'll touch on a number of different subjects here. Any fiction is all about world building, because you have to construct the construct that the characters are going to live in, the scenario, the world, whatever. Now, obviously, with fantasy, in a way, it's doubly difficult, because you now also have to make up the rules of how that world functions. So, like how the magic works and things like that. So, at least with World War II, I have a fairly straightforward set of circumstances that I can work with. I know the timelines, I know the major events, and I know the strokes that I need to hit. But the thing with world building, and particularly historical writing, is detail, and how much detail. So question to the room: when you're reading fiction, hands in the air, are you the kind of person, when you're reading a book, you want pages and pages of detail to sort of suck you into the world and set things up for you? No hands. Okay, so everybody just wants just enough to tease the imagination. Okay, so straight away there, challenge for the author: how much is too much? Because for me, I might do 5 pages. Well, that might be too much for you, or not enough. So tastes vary. But the thing is, certain genres have certain conventions. So techno thrillers, by and large, are quite detailed, because it's the technology. Crime fiction can be detailed, but then it also pulls in a lot about emotion and thought, as the detective sort of picks through the crime and has to try and figure out the motive and things like that. So world building, very important. But what you find as an author is you're pulled in 3 different directions, because you have the genre expectation, you have your own style, and then similarly sitting alongside that, you also have your own personal taste. And somewhere in the middle there, all 3 have to meet up, because if you're writing a particular genre that requires certain things, like Agatha Christie, the denouement, where Poirot gets everybody in the room and he explains it all at the end. Very much a trope of that kind of fiction. But are you now going to bust that convention and do it differently? So straight away you're going to be challenging the expectations of your audience. Particularly if you're a new author and they're not familiar with you. Is that going to, I don't like that because he doesn't follow the rules. So you've always got that push-pull against what you want to do versus what, say, the market expects, or the expectations within the genre. So if we talk about the burden of past masters, for example, the golden rule for me is detail must serve the story. It must not throw the brakes on, because if you're giving too much to the point where you forgot what was actually happening, well, that's no good. So it can't derail the narrative. So there's this balancing act you must strike as an author to keep the story moving along, while at the same time drip feeding the information to the audience, whether it's through exposition, dialogue, detail, paragraphs, things like that. So for me, when you look at historical fiction, it sort of breaks down into 2 groups. You've got the likes of Jane Austen, Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, Ian Fleming as fiction, and then on the other side you'll have the likes of David Webber, Hilary Mantel. And what's particular about the two groups is the first group tend to be, the books are quite thin. I must admit, the first time ever I got Agatha Christie, I couldn't believe how short it was. You know, where's all the detail? Where's all the descriptive stuff? You know, it's very tight and it's very focused on the story. And then about every other year I sort of drag out War and Peace by Tolstoy, and I think I'll give it another go. And I faithfully read every page for about the first half, and then I get really, really bored by all the description, and then I end up sort of skipping 10 pages, and I discover I haven't actually missed anything yet, because there's so much detail. And the big difference between these two is, and this is where we have to realise it, is Jane Austen and Agatha Christie, they're not historical novels. They are for us now, but they were contemporary fiction for the day. So when Christie mentions, like, you know, Poirot comes off the dock and he's got his Vuitton steamer case with him, that's it. But now if I was to write that scene, there'd be a few paragraphs describing what he's wearing and the location and, you know, what a steamer case looks like, because a lot of people these days don't know. Of course, the thing is when we read this stuff as an audience, we know what it looks like because it's on TV all the time. You know, you've got the other Bennett sister on at the moment, you've got Pride and Prejudice, you've got all the Poirot episodes. So our brain is already filling in the gaps because we have the medium of television to help us fill those gaps. But obviously, as an author, I haven't got that luxury now. I do in a little bit, because obviously as I'm doing World War II, if I say a Spitfire, most people know what one of those looks like. You know, if I say, oh, he's wearing an RAF uniform, I'm pretty much sorted, you know. So I can shortcut it to some degree, but there are still certain requirements. Now, admittedly, it does depend what period of fiction you're writing about. So Victorian fiction, Tudor fiction, Elizabethan, that's on TV a lot, okay? It's very popular, people know quite a bit about it, and they want those details to be right. Similarly, Rome and Greece, as much as we're less familiar with it, we have certain expectations because of all the films and stuff you've seen, you know, and the big Hollywood epics and stuff. But if you pick a story in the Dark Ages, practically do what you want, you know, because not much is known. Bernard Cornwell, for example, does that very good trilogy about the Arthurian legend, and he sort of bases it on the fact, well, what if Arthur was a real person in the Dark Ages? He knows he's got certain broad strokes he needs to hit, but exact customs, up for grabs, how things worked, up for grabs, and so that gives him a lot of room. As long as he creates the mood and he creates the world, he has a lot of freedom to do what he wants. But if you do some other stuff, you start running into, you know, people sometimes maybe know better than you know. So when you're dealing with world building, you have to get the details right. You have to craft your scene, and you have to come up with dialogue that suits the subject. So the big thing really, well, you'll agree, is research. Research. You've got to live it, breathe it. Once you're comfortable with your topic, then that's when you can start deviating from the facts. You know, you can sort of start taking a few little liberties here and there, because if you get most of it right, the audience will forgive certain things or certain deviations from the historical record that suit your story. Yeah. So the more authentic the world you create, the more that the audience will go with you on the journey. So then, of course, the next challenge is if you're going to do historical fiction, how are you going to deal with your historical setting? Yeah. Are you going to just have your characters living in this time period? Yeah. Are they going to be involved in actual real world events in some fashion? And then if they are they involved but their involvement has no effect on the outcome? Are they involved and actually what they does inadvertently means that historical event actually comes to pass, you know? Or conversely, they end up doing something that means it doesn't. So you've got ways and means to do stuff. So example, like World War II films, how many World War II films have we seen where the main story is they're training for some big operation and, you know, at the end success, but it doesn't actually make a difference to the overall thing of the war, because it doesn't change the outcome. It's just, you know, you're giving people a story set within that period. And then obviously we were discussing earlier the film Dunkirk, it shows you it, but nothing that actually happens changes the outcome. It's using it as a backdrop to give you something to hang the story on. And as I say, sometimes the audience are very knowledgeable and sometimes more than you. An example, a colleague of mine does Elizabethan and Tudor fiction. So one of the things she wrote about was a scene involving Queen Elizabeth and her speech at Tilbury in 1588, which is during the time of the Armada. And it's a well-known event. We don't know exactly the full dialogue of the speech, but there's about 2 really well-known versions of the accounts of the speech. There are some differences, but there's also a lot of commonality. So it's generally accepted that that is pretty much what Queen Elizabeth said. So anyway, during her research, she comes up with a 3rd version that's a very contemporaneous account, never really quoted by anybody, and it's pretty much gone unnoticed for a long, long time. So this is the version she uses in her novel. Okay, next thing she knows, she starts getting messages from people. Oh, you haven't done that right. That's wrong. She never said this. Da-da. Well, and this is the battle, because we do the research. We know we're right. Yeah, we've got more material. But now you're starting to bump into the audience expectation, or sometimes the audience think they know better than you, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. One of my books, I mentioned salt and vinegar crisps, until someone pointed out to me that salt and vinegar crisps didn't actually come about until about 1967, which I didn't know. And even cheese and onion didn't come about until the 1950s. It was just ready salted. So, I have to go back in and change the text and make a little alteration there and sort that out. So yeah, but then again, that was a humbling reminder that this is the trick. The more detail you put in, the more stumbling blocks you throw in front of yourself that somebody might just pick up on. But conversely, someone did a review on mine saying, "Oh, it's a nonsense. This he gives them a posthumous DFC. That wasn't." Well, yeah, they were. They were handed out posthumously. There's plenty of examples where that did happen. So again, you have that contrast between sometimes people think they know what they're talking about, and sometimes they don't. So that was also interesting as well. Now I'm also going to touch on the voice of a place, because as writers now, there's so much research material out there. You've got the internet, you've got photographs of places, you've got Wikipedia, you can go on Google Maps and actually see it, and you've got the satellite view and stuff. But that can make for a very dry reading experience. And then when you also drag in the old phrase of write what you know. Yeah. Well, the same also goes for places, and you can research a place, but being there will always give you that something extra. It's like, for example, one of my books. It may see the light of day at some point, but it starts off in Tynemouth, which is where I grew up. So the first 30, 40 pages was an absolute doddle, because I've been there. I know exactly what that looks like at sunset when the sun comes in from a certain angle and it hits the rocks, and what the waves sound like and everything. But it takes you one step beyond from a writer for the audience, because now I'm building in something a bit more sensory to bring you into the experience of it. Similarly, in Demons in the Dark, some of that is set in Kingston upon Thames, which is where my grandparents lived. So I'd been there loads of times in the summer holiday to stay when I was a kid. So the road where the main character's family lives, yeah, that's where she lived, and the houses, yeah, that's the house described. So you're able to pull in these real-time experiences. Similarly, when I was younger, I was in the Air Cadets for years, so I've been on RAF bases, so I know what it's like when you smell the jet fuel and the tang of the oil and all those sorts of things. And this is all the sort of thing you build in to your world building to give you more authenticity. And then, of course, language, the dreaded trap there. Do you just go with some contemporary language so that the audience can relate more easily? Do you drop in old-fashioned terms to sort of give a period flavour? Television, there was a TV series, Spartacus, run 10 or 15 years ago. They went very stylised. They took out certain adjectives when they write the dialogue to give it the sort of stilted flow of Latin. And they drop in some Latin phrases to give you the period flavour. But then when you look at Hollywood epics of like Ben-Hur from the 50s, everybody just talks absolutely normally. yeah, because it's how the audience relates. And the big thing for writing particularly is avoiding modern slang and speech terminology. And again, this is where you sometimes bump into people going like, oh, they didn't say that. Well, yeah, I've done the research and I know that phrase comes from that period, you know, and sometimes there's this push-pull of how you get around things, and it's, and again, we touched on this before, the Dambusters, obviously well known, a particular dog with a certain name, which I will not repeat in an open forum, but perfectly normal for the time, problematic today. How you deal with that. So if they were to remake the film, there's already a massive fuss over how are they going to deal with the name of the dog? Well, that's dead easy. You just don't mention it. You know, you can easily go, come on, boy, come on. You don't mention the dog. You just you know, and the dog comes over. And you can get around it. But it's one of those things where you deal with things. I mean, if you look at TV series now from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, they're all getting like trigger warnings on when they broadcast them for people to say, oh yeah, you may find certain scenarios or language offensive, you know. Yeah, but it wasn't at the time. It was of its time. I mean, even Friends recently got battered in the press for, you know, and this is made in the 90s. So again, when you're writing historical fiction, it's like, do you go with stuff that isn't necessarily going to match modern sensibilities but gives you period flavour, knowing that this might upset somebody, or do you just avoid that altogether? And again, another big challenge, you know, how do you navigate this? Do you stick to your guns and use certain period appropriate phrases to make it right, yeah, and appropriate to the time, or do you just not bother? So these are all things that are whirling around our heads constantly while we're writing. And then the other thing that struck me recently was one of the books that's going to be coming soon is the third book in a series, and the squadron's got as far as Burma. So we're now going to have them fighting alongside the Indian Army and some Indian pilots and things. And so racism is going to become quite a large part of certain attitudes within the characters. And I'm like, oh, you know, I've sort of avoided this for a while, and I know I'm not going to get away with it anymore because, you know, I'm a white heterosexual male. How can I possibly, you know, write about the experience, say, of a World War II Afro-Caribbean male as a main character? You know, I could. There's plenty of research material out there for that, and there'll be lots of first-hand accounts, so I'm quite sure I could take some of the scenarios that are described and come up with something, but should I? You know, can I provide an authentic character viewpoint when that is way outside my own lived experience? Because straight away I'm going to have to address prejudices of the era, and I guarantee whatever I stick in, it by modern standards is almost going to be, oh, it's a stereotype. Well, yeah, but this is what these guys went through, you know. But I don't want it to be preachy. I don't want to come across with like a modern view and try and sort of like bend it to modern sensibilities. You know, if I've got to, you know, if I'm doing this period setting, I want to try and keep to that. So I've got some hurdles to cross shortly for that one. It's like, can I do it justice, but also should I, is really the big question. I've sort of avoided it up till now, but I'm not going to get away with it for very much longer. The big thing at the end of the day is just research. You've got to get in your topic and bring it all together. So the challenge, really, to sort of really summarise that question is, you've got to think about how you're going to convey that information. And do you go with the conventions of the genre? Do you break them and do something? These are all creative choices, but you can't do that until you're on a firm footing with your actual knowledge of the topic, because then you know what you can bend and what you can break, what you can ignore, what you can even subvert sometimes, because then you know where you are on a solid footing without having to, you know, wade through the quagmire of questions that come with that.
It almost, from what you're saying, it almost feels like there's a responsibility for you as an author, because I think World War II particularly do you feel there's an expectation on us to even in fiction, to actually get it right, because it's such a popular theme, it's a popular interest for many people, even if you're not a writer. You can see this we have a lot of World War II events, reenactors. I go to Eden Camp a lot, and that is mainly World War II. So do you think there's an expectation on us as authors to get to, it's like a big responsibility, it feels like that from,
yeah,
to nail it and to get it right?
Well, it's doubly so because a couple of times I sort of flirted with the idea of maybe doing one much more modern day, maybe, hey, let's do something about the Falklands, because it's a bit more contemporary. And I've looked at it and it's like, there's not a gap there that I can really shoot for, because there was only 2 carriers, there's only a bunch of guys there, and it's like, if I'm going to fictionalize this, it's going to become more difficult because a lot of them are still alive. And now I'm trampling on actual lived experience, whereas at least with World War II now, I mean, it's frightening. You think it's getting on for nearly 90 years ago. Most of the veterans are no longer here. So I've got that space to be able to still do something respectful, but at the same time, I've got the room to maybe, I don't know, take a few liberties with things to suit the story, which you wouldn't necessarily do if you were doing something more contemporary. And I mean, I'll touch on an element of that in the next section, which will be talked about the actual guys in Malta. But yeah, I mean, I think if I'm going to write about, again, this comes to me because I have a history background. If I'm going to do it, let's do it properly. Yeah, I'm not going to, go off wild left field and like win the war in 1943, say, with something. I'm going to stick to the script and come up with something, but I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it right.
Yeah. Okay, so that moves on to the next question then. So there are so many aircraft and events of World War II that become historical legends, such as Spitfire in the Battle of Britain, Lancaster in the Dam Buster raid. If your research revealed a disparity between the legend and the fact, how do you deal with that? And especially with reference to your latest book as well.
Yeah, a great deal of thought. The thing that as I say, I do all the research is I'm looking for something that's interesting, and sometimes I'll start bumping up against differences between sort of accepted fact that gets quoted everywhere, like in Wikipedia, for example. And then when you actually delve into the detail, it ain't necessarily so. So I'll deal with this in 2 parts. I'll talk about some of the aircraft situations first, and then I'll talk about the sort of the historical scenario side. So aircraft are like people. They acquire reputation. So the Spitfire is a gentleman's aircraft. The 109 could be a bit of a handful at times and things like that. Those things aren't really in dispute. But when I look at other stuff, so like the Fairey Battle, the Bristol Blenheim, they get a very unfair reputation because they got cut to pieces at the beginning of the war. But it wasn't because they were necessarily bad aircraft. They were just in the wrong situation. They weren't used properly. The Germans had the tactical advantage and things like that. But that has coloured very much the perception of those aircraft in the mainstream. So it's almost like I sort of like pick up the baton and sort of like want to start fighting their corner, and setting the records straight. Similarly, if we look at like Whirlwind Fury, which was my 10th book, this deals with the Western Whirlwind, and that's a really maligned aircraft, and it was maligned because it was like, there's from some very common myths with it, that the engines were bad, it was too fast to land at small grass airfields, it didn't perform very well. And I start reading, because I always thought this is a pretty aircraft, this will make a nice story. And I start reading, and it turns out, actually the engines weren't that bad. Yeah, but they had some teething trouble because it was a development of a new engine, but in reality it was because Rolls-Royce didn't really want to develop it any further. They wanted to focus on the Griffin and the Merlins. So eventually they got Air Ministry permission to stop production. But of course, the plane had been designed around it. No engine, no aircraft. And people go, oh, well, why didn't they put a Merlin in it? Well, you can't, because the propeller disc for the Merlin is bigger than that of the Peregrine. So with the spacing of the wings and the design and everything, they couldn't just do that. It would mean it'd have to be completely redesigned. So the Air Ministry just turned around and went, well, no, thanks very much. We'll leave it there. And that's, even then, that's simplifying things. But if you type in the Western Whirlwind and you say, what were the issues with it? This is the same old stuff that comes up again and again and again. And I read the books and it's not right at all. And all the guys who actually flew it said, oh, it's a lovely plane to fly. It was really maneuverable. It could hold its own against the enemy fighters. And I thought, right, there's a story in itself, because not only do we have the story of the squadron, running alongside it is various scenes where I dip in with the designer going to the Ministry of Aircraft Production, and he's fighting his corner, and you know the big wigs are against him, and this is it, your fate is sealed. So in a way we end up with two stories running in parallel, you know, the guys fighting, and at the same time what was happening with the production side of it as well, which has never really sort of been done before in fiction, as far as I know. And the books are there, it's just the sort of the myth has become established, and that's it. It is a rubbish aircraft. Similarly, Maximum Effort, we start with the Avro Manchester, which I wasn't aware of at all. It was the predecessor to the Lancaster, and that was terrible because the engines were really bad. They had a tendency to catch fire, things like that. But the plane nearly got binned entirely. Let's make more Halifaxes. And then Roy Chadwick goes, hang on, I've got an idea here. Why don't we? And they make the wings slightly longer. They put 4 engines on it, and voila, we have the Lancaster. You know, no Manchester, no Lancaster. So again, something I'd never heard of, something certainly not mainstream, but it gave me extra dimension to the story. So it's now not just a story about Bomber Command. It gives me the angle to come in with this very unknown aircraft, or much maligned aircraft, and show, well, actually, yeah, it had problems. It perhaps wasn't as bad as it's made out to be, but at the same time, it gives us that journey to the Lancaster coming into service. So it's always interesting, even when I'm looking at any of the books, you're always coming up against sort of like commonly accepted facts that are maybe not quite right. And there's room there for me to sort of tilt at those, because I like doing that. I like sort of setting the record straight and putting things out there to show that actually this is the alternative to things. Then we sort of come to the second part, when you start coming up against legend of actual of fact. So everybody's heard the whole thing, you know, eat carrots you can see in the dark. Yeah, anybody actually know where it come from? Radar. Yeah, radar. Radar, 1940, we start putting radar on some fighters to fly at night to shoot down the German bombers during the Blitz, and we know full well that suddenly we go from shooting virtually none down to we'll start taking out quite a few of them, and the Germans are going to figure out something that's going on here. What are we going to do about this? Good idea. Tell you, carrots have got this stuff in that help you see in the dark. Yeah, if you eat millions of carrots, it's not, you know, but it was put out, so that's what it puts out on propaganda. Cat's eyes, Cunningham, he eats carrots, he can see in the dark, it's brilliant. Because we didn't want to admit that we had radar, we didn't want the Germans not finding that one out, so that's where that myth comes from. I've already spoken about the Tilbury speech and how there is differing versions. Another common one, Napoleon was short. No, he wasn't, he was 5'7", he was actually slightly above average height for the period, but that was all British propaganda, because he was the great ogre of Europe who was at war with the English, so we made him short, and that seems to have stuck. Vikings having horned helmets, no, never happened either. Good story though, but you know, visually attractive, but no. Another one from World War II is about the Tuskegee Airmen, which is the units of the American Air Force, which was all black pilots, segregated unit, and the myth is that they never lost a bomber that they escorted during the war. Total fiction. It's on record, they clearly lost some, and I got really annoyed with George Lucas actually about this, but it all came about during the civil rights era after the war. It was a way to really promote the expertise of the black squadrons at a time when obviously civil rights was a hot topic in America in the 60s. But George Lucas, about, I'll get this wrong, about 15 years or so ago, did a film called Red Tails, which was a modern retelling of the Tuskegee Airmen. And dialogue's awful because George Lucas always does terrible dialogue, but it looked great and it was a good story. And then right at the end, it comes up with, like, the words at the end saying what happened next, and it trots out they never lost a plane that they were escorting, and I was absolutely steaming because it's like, why bother? It's a myth. It's been busted. It's not even like, still accepted. It's been clearly debunked many times in recent time, and he stuck it as a tagline at the end of the film, and I got really annoyed because it's like, he didn't need to put that there. It's a good enough film, it can stand on its own. Why are you bothering to put that at the very end? So I was very miffed, which is where we then come on to my issue with my latest book, which is The Bright Sky Above. Anybody familiar with the legend of Faith, Hope and Charity? Nobody? Shocked. Right, okay. There's three really well-known myths when it comes to the Malta siege. If you ask someone about the Malta siege, you'll probably get one of these three. The legend of Faith, Hope and Charity, the one about the Ohio tanker, and the one about the Spitfire reinforcements to the island in 1942. And the second two generally come about from people all seeing the film The Malta Story, which came out in 1953. So the thing with the Ohio was true. It was at a stage of the war where if we don't get some food and we don't get ammunition and we don't get fuel to the island, it's going to surrender pretty soon. And in the film you actually see the real newsreel footage where the tanker gets brought in, and it had been abandoned about 3 times during the convoy, and then it didn't sink, so they went back on board. And to get it in, they actually had to lash it to 2 destroyers, because the deck was literally that far above the surface of the water. It was that close to going under, but they get it in, and saves Malta because it brings all the fuel to keep the fighters going. The thing with the Spitfire reinforcements is how they land. The Germans catch them on the ground, destroy most of them, so then we have to do it again a few weeks later, and then that's what eventually pretty much breaks the siege, because now there's enough fighters that are serviceable to deal with the German raids that are coming over. But the thing that always struck me, and this is where this comes in, is the legend of Faith, Hope and Charity. It's a great image. Is at the very beginning of the siege of Malta, there was only 3 fighters on the island to defend the entire island against the whole of the Italian Air Force. So on the one side of the page you've got 3 fighters, and on the other side the Italians have about 800 aircraft. So, on paper they shouldn't even last a day. They're obsolete, they're biplanes, they're not even fast enough to catch what they're supposed to be shooting down. They were that outdated. They were the last biplane fighter in the RAF. And I had first read this in my 20s, a book by Kenneth Pullman, which helps in a way sort of perpetuate the myth. But it had started very early in the war, because even very early on, propaganda latched onto this, that this actually happened, and it's a real David and Goliath story, so it very much ingrains itself into the public imagination. So I'm like, I want to do this because there is a Maltese connection for me, because my grandfather was Maltese and I've been over the island a few times, and then obviously I've read about this a lot, and I was like, super story, and I kept putting it off because I didn't think I was good enough. Very personal. I want to do it justice. So I start digging, and then it turns out there wasn't 3 of them, there was 4. And everybody forgets the 4th one. And then I sort of dig some more, and what it boils down to is the fact that the Maltese population never saw more than 3 in the air at once. The 4th one was always kept in reserve, so if one of them gets shot up, they can swap them as a spare, repair the other one and keep going. So they never ever saw 4 in the air at once, so 3, and then because Malta is very religious island. They're Roman Catholic. Faith, hope, and charity. The three graces, very particular to the island, and that's why it became. And it's never really known where the legend comes from. It just suddenly started appearing in print. Then it's got propaganda posters, and then even the pilots themselves on the island start referring to the aircraft by name in their logbooks. So at some point it just crept into the consciousness, and that was it. It was the three. And then I'm suddenly sort of now stuck, because it's like, well, what am I going to do? Because you've got this very nice legend here that makes a wonderful story, but at the same time, I felt that the actual real story was probably just as stirring, if not more so, because you're still at the same situation. You've got 4 aircraft, 7 pilots, no spares, in the middle of the Mediterranean on their own. The enemy's 60 miles away. They can be here in 15 minutes, and they've got to keep going. So I finally, after my 10th book, sort of buckled down and actually did it. But even now, I think maybe I should change my advertising tagline, because I think on the advertising it says 4 planes, 7 pilots, no spares, and the number of comments on the advert saying there was only 3. Yeah, no, there was 4. I promise you, there was 4. But it's how you deal with that, And now you think this is easy, tell the story, but the issue's how do I write it? Well, for me, as I've sort of mentioned a few times now, is it's about focusing on the factual side of things, and I think the sort of the myth element will take care of itself, because people will read that, and if they're familiar with the legend, there'll be some new information there, and if they're not familiar with the legend, then I've sort of done my job anyway. But another way to get round that is I always put a historical note at the end on the books. And I will discuss a little bit about, well, you've read so-and-so, this is what was real, I made that bit up, and more often than not, it's the more fantastical stuff that seems very unlikely is the stuff that actually did happen, as is the way with war stories. But the other difficulty I now had is up until now I've been talking about how I always find a gap in history, or I use a real event as a backdrop which my guys can be on the fringe of, or I can participate in but not have to worry about. Well, with this one, I didn't have anywhere to run, because I'm now placing my main character. I wanted to tell the story of faith, hope, and charity, and now I'm stuck, because the guys they're fighting alongside, they aren't fictional characters, they are the 7 real pilots who were actually there. And now I'm like, well, now what am I going to do? Because like you said, you touched on, we have this sort of like obligation to tell it properly, and I'm stuck, because when you read some of the research material, some of the older accounts, the writers, they clearly spoke to the actual pilots, because they quote them directly at times, and there's a mention of a diary, which I've never seen. But I just didn't have quite enough to use the real names, because this is where it starts getting sticky. I can't libel the dead, but at the same time I don't want to be upsetting family and putting noses out of joint, because this is history here. This isn't some game, this isn't some random thing that I'm dealing with. I'm actually dealing with historical events, and so I end up doing what I can do is you make analogues of them. You give them all similar names, and I mix up some of the characteristics between them. So if you know your history, you know exactly who's who. Yeah, but at the same time, it gives me the wiggle room as an author to actually just tell a story, which is the whole point. This is supposed to entertain, not preach. So I had to tread this line, and I went into the tank for weeks, because for once I was actually dealing with something that was quite personal to me, and at the same time right in the middle of actual historical stuff. He's right there, and I danced around it for a bit, and then finally I sort of got into the mindset which I normally do when I write, and just write it, and the story will take care of itself, and I can worry about some of the details later and make the corrections as I go along, because if I keep agonizing over it, I'm never going to get this done. And that's what I did in the end. But it's how you can sympathetically portray, I think would probably be the term to use. You want to be respectful of the men and the material, while at the same time putting in additional little bits and pieces to make it a story rather than just a retelling of stuff. So, as I say, then that's when you use the author's note to address certain controversies and get to that. So I mean, to really summarize it all writing historical fiction is fiction with more detail attached, but it's figuring out how you're going to do it, because you could give a massive block of text, which is great, dull as dishwater, not entertaining, so you have to break it up with dialogue, and you bring in some of that information in different ways to keep it entertaining for the audience. But it isn't easy.
I mean, we talked about this earlier about when you've got a family connection with something that you're writing, even though it's historical fiction, you're pulled into it emotionally, and the actual drive and responsibility to absolutely get that right and represent it right can actually haunt you for a long time, and can actually stop you writing.
Did you
feel that?
Very early on, because I always struggle to sort of find sort of the voice of the book when I first start, because every single time I start a new one, it's a new set of characters, and I've got to try and sort of find the feel, how they all interact with each other, how they talk. And doubly with this one, because I'm now actually dealing with 7 real guys, and I've got my little crib sheet on the side of who's what, and then I've got next to it the other column of the fictional version of who's what, and I'm trying to marry it up in my head. And I went round and round the maypole quite a few times with it, until eventually I was like, right, no, just write, get it down, and you can correct it later, because if I get things mixed up, fine, I'll worry about it later on, because I've got to get this started, I've got to get going, and sort of just push through, and that was it. Then I was flying. But for 3 or 4 weeks I was just like picking at it, and I was just writing notes and notebook and just not getting anywhere, and I'm like, oh god, it's going to take me ages, and then eventually you just push through, you just get on with it.
I mean, you must feel very proud now it's out.
Oh yeah. But no, well, and then now I'm on to book 2. So I mean, originally I envisaged it as one massive story, and I've ended up splitting it into 2 books. So you've got book 1, which is The Bright Sky Above, and then the second half is going to be coming out later this year in about October. Some of the same characters come across to the second book, but just to get it down, because it's been 30 years in the making, this one.
Wow. Okay, wow. I mean, I found it very inspiring as a writer, and I'm sure you have as well. And I won't say thank you to Vincent, but actually we've now got time for Q&A. If anybody's got any questions that you'd like to ask Vincent, just pop your hand up and just shout out.
Anybody?
Yeah.
I'd like to ask, you said that you say something that you know is fact. Somebody will contact you and tell you you're wrong. Do you get back to them? Do you argue with them?
Well, unfortunately, if they put it on an Amazon review, I can't. You used to be able to respond, and they turned that feature off, because I think it turned into a bit of a war. But unfortunately, it happens. But thankfully, if I get enough reviews on it, just sort of like tends to disappear down the list. So I don't worry about it. But very occasionally, someone will contact me and say, "Oh, you've not done this right," and we have a civil discussion. Anybody else?
Anyone else got a question?
But it's more of a sort of comment. My father was in the RAF during the war, but he was a wages clerk.
Right.
People always say, "Oh, was he a pilot?" Like that's the only.
Yeah.
So do you put any of the? Because I haven't. Apologize, I haven't read
No.
But do you use like ordinary, all the other necessary people, like the stores?
In some of the earlier books, less so. I think one of the very first ones I did, there was the intelligence officer, and then some of the ground staff are in there as well. Then I suppose maybe I wouldn't say lost focus, but I tried to lean the stories up a bit, because some of the earlier ones were quite big, very long, tons of characters, and it all got a bit confusing when it came to the editing. So I sort of, some of the middle books I sort of leaned it up a bit and focused the story a little bit more, and then as I've gotten better, I suppose would be the way to describe it, is it's opened up a little bit more again. So like particularly for the Malta story, there's some of the ground staff. Similarly for Whirlwind Fury and Demons in the Dark, because it pulls it in, because also from a writing standpoint, not every chapter can be action and flying. There's the time on the ground, and there's the waiting around and what they got up to and stuff. And so like with Demons in the Dark, because it was the development of the radar, we have some boffins in there, we've got some of the ground crew, and they're sort of sucking on the teeth when the pilot lands, and he goes, well, can you not just do this? And they're like, well, you know, and you get that back and forth, and it makes it's good for writing, because it gives you more character moments, because that's really what it's about. It's giving you that little glimpse into different aspects of things. So yeah, I probably need to do more of it, but it's just, you know, it naturally comes into the story as I go along.
I think I read somewhere that for every Spitfire pilot, you had 20 ground staff.
Something like that, yeah, because you've got the instrument bashers, you've got the instrument bashers, the engine fitters, you've got the armourers, you know, adds up to a lot of, and that's just for one plane, yeah.
Maybe it's a book you should write.
You have to be more to it.
Are there any more questions?
Yeah, listening to you today has reminded me very much of the Biggles books.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if you've read them.
Oh, well, yeah,
A lot of inspiration.
when I was a kid I had loads, and I mean, one review recently compared me to Len Deaton, which was quite nice, Douglas Freeman, Bernard Cornwell and Derek Robinson, which was fine, because that's exactly what I was shooting for, because those are the sorts of books within that genre. Bernard Cornwell obviously has Sharp, Alexander Kent and Douglas Freeman, who are actually the same person, just under two different names. So that's Napoleonic naval and World War II naval covered. But apart from Derek Robinson, and in fact, like a few years ago, the 633 Squadron books, again, similar thing, but there's not really been anything sort of like more modern to that. So I've sort of slipped in to that little gap there, and that's the sort of thing that I aim for. The style, it's pacey, it's not too bogged down in detail, it's a nice, entertaining read, chapters that are 10, 12, 15 pages long, so you sort of like get a little bite of it. Oh, I enjoyed that, right, we'll read another chapter, because you know the next bit's not going to be that long, you know. And that's the sort of the focus. I don't want it to be overwhelmingly detailed. It has to entertain, and it has to pull you along with the characters, and then yeah, that's the sort of stuff that I aim for, yeah, very much so.
Any more questions?
I haven't really got any books yet, Vincent, but I'm guessing...
On sale.
I'm guessing you've had quite a bit of airtime in each of the various...
I was in the Air Cadets, so I got something like about 70 hours of stick time when I was in the Air Cadets, because you get air experience flights. When I was 16, I was really lucky. I got a flight in a Hunter jet, because we were at RAF, I think it was Lucas in Scotland, not long after the first Gulf War, and they'd all just come back, and we were all there at annual camp, and we were doing a squadron visit, and they went, oh, training flight's been scrubbed, but it's still scheduled. I still have trouble with the logic of that one, but because it was still scheduled, they were going to fly it. So I said, well, who wants a flight? Well, of course, 20 pairs of hands go in the air. So we all drew cards for it, and I won. So I've got this lovely photograph of me like Tom Cruise with all the gear on, helmet under the arm, age 16, very nice. And there we are off at close to Mach 1, Loch Ness, 30,000 feet for an hour at the age of 16, fantastic. But so I've done flying, and then I've also been lucky with some stuff as well. When I've been down to Duxford for one of the air shows, I got to sit in the only surviving Blenheim that's airworthy, which was informative, because at one point in the first draft I have the pilot look left and notice something coming towards him. So I thought, well, I'm in it, I'll have a look, and it turns out the engines are in the way. So it's a good job I actually did get that seat, because little things like, so this is the thing, little things like that make the difference, and this is where the details come in. So whenever I go down to the air shows and stuff, I try and nab the guys who actually fly these things and, you know, pump them for information. And in fact, recently online there's been some good articles where some of the guys who fly these at the air shows write an article about what it's like to fly it. So the startup, the takeoff run and all that, and I can just pinch little details and slot that in because we're providing the experience. And yeah, so I've had just enough of a thing myself to know what it's like and do some aerobatics and stuff. When I was in the Air Cadets, we shot. We had our own armory, and we also did a guns course. And again, when I was at Leeming, Lucas that year, because they'd just come back from the Gulf War, they brought a lot of Russian stuff back with them. So we were down the range with some AK-47s and things. So, but this is all, it can all inform the experience. I've shot stuff when I was in uni. I was in the OTC, so I did a couple of infantry assaults with the regulars and the Brecons. I was also in the Royal Naval Unit. So although I've never actually served in the military, I've been to sea with the Navy, I've done some stuff with the infantry, I've done some flying, so I can use all of that to pull it in to the books and give it that extra layer of experience, you know.
Yeah, I've actually been on a Lancaster, and I have to say it completely changed my view of the airmen, what they did, obviously for the Jam Busters, just because of the actual design of the airplane and how claustrophobic it was, and how scary it must have been. And it was quite humbling, really. I felt quite tearful because I'd never appreciated it before, even though I knew about it. Until I actually sat on that plane, I never appreciated how difficult it must have been.
Well, yeah, I mean, when I was in Malta recently, we went to the Air Museum and I sat in the Spitfire they've got there, and you know, obviously I'm quite a tall guy, I'm 6'2", and it's tight. And I'm not even wearing any bulky flying clothing yet, and the thought of trying to bail out of one of these things when it's falling out of the sky, you've got G-forces, you've got the slipstream battering at you, and that's just out of a fighter. You know, in a bomber at night, in the pitch black, when it's falling out and you're going for the not very big escape hatch, trying to find it, you know, it must have been absolutely terrifying. So yeah, I'm lucky that I get to experience it in these terms rather than that, yeah.
Any more questions?
Just a brief comment followed by a brief question. Roderick here has read War and Peace several times over. No counting for pages. And the question is, in your spare time, if you have any, when you're not reading or researching military history, what literature do you actually read?
Yeah, okay. When I'm not actually writing or researching, that is when I will actually read fiction as well, particularly like World War II stuff, so like some of the Commando comics and things. When I was a kid, I got some of them and other fictions, but I try not to read any fiction when I'm actually writing, because I find that I tend to sort of absorb and then suddenly certain lines of dialogue start appearing and I think, God, that's really amazing, and then it turns out, yeah, it isn't mine because I read it somewhere else. So I have to sort of like keep myself very compartmentized. But no, God, I read so much science fiction, hard science, history, all sorts of stuff. Because I mean, even when I was a kid, I would read 4 or 5 books a week. I would just read everything, and that's good because it sort of gives me the sort of breadth of things that I can tap into now. But when I'm not writing, that is the time when I will actually read other stuff. Like the thing recently I read was it Shackleton who got marooned on his way to Antarctica? Oh, yeah, there was a book I got recently which is all about that. So that's been really, really interesting because it's a nice change from all the war stuff. Yeah, and he did, and yeah, that just made a nice alternative change to guns and bullets and all the rest of it.
Yeah. Any more questions? No, we finished.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Just as a side note, Vincent has brought his books. They are for sale if you want to just have a look. And he will be here now, just if anybody has another question that you want to ask him, if you've not been brave enough to shout out, that's fine. But can we just say a big thank you to Vincent? I found it inspiring. Thank you.